The sky darkened with incoming shells, and we lit it up with tracers. My FM-2 Wildcat screamed off the deck of USS Kitkun Bay, climbing into what would become the most desperate air battle of my life. Behind me, the escort carrier's flight deck erupted in fountains of seawater as Japanese battleship rounds straddled her hull. It was October 25, 1944, and Admiral Kurita's entire center force, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had caught us with our pants down off the coast of Samar. We were about to fight the most lopsided naval battle in American history, and somehow we were going to win. My name is Lieutenant Jack Morrison, and I flew Wildcats with Composite Squadron 5 aboard the Kitkun Bay. That morning started like any other in the Philippine Sea. We'd been operating as part of Taffy 3, one of 3 escort carrier groups providing air support for the late landings. Our little flat tops weren't built for fleet actions. They were converted merchant hulls designed to haul troops and supplies, then fitted with flight decks to ferry aircraft and provide close air support. We carried maybe 30 planes each, mostly FM-2 Wildcats and TBF Avengers. Our destroyers and destroyer escorts were tin cans armed with 5-inch pop guns. We were the naval equivalent of a pickup truck, and we'd just run headfirst into a freight train. I was in the ready room at 0645, drinking coffee and going over the morning's patrol schedule with my wingman, Ensign Tommy Chen, when the ship's klaxon started wailing. Then came the voice over the 1MC that changed everything. General quarters, general quarters. All hands to battle stations. This is no drill. Enemy surface force bearing 040, range 18 miles, closing fast. Tommy nearly choked on his coffee. Surface force? What the hell? The ship lurched violently to starboard, throwing us both against the bulkhead. Through the ready room porthole, I caught a glimpse of towering water spouts erupting around our formation. Those weren't depth charges. Those were battleship rounds. I briefed. They're shooting at us. The 1MC crackled again. Now launch all available aircraft. I repeat, launch all available aircraft immediately. I grabbed my helmet and life vest, Tommy right behind me. We sprinted down the passageway and up the ladder to the flight deck, where controlled chaos reigned. Flight deck crews were frantically spotting aircraft, pushing Wildcats and Avengers into position while colored shells screamed overhead. The noise was incredible, not just our own engines and propellers, but the deep, resonant boom of heavy naval rifles punctuated by the crash of near misses. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, our plane captain, was already turning over my Wildcat's Wright R-1820 engine. The big radial coughed to life in a cloud of blue smoke, settling into its familiar rhythm. I climbed into the cockpit, strapping myself in while Martinez helped me with my shoulder harness. "What's the word, Chief?" I shouted over the engine noise. "Big trouble, Lieutenant," he yelled back. "Battleships, lots of them. Skipper says get airborne and attack anything that floats." I looked around the flight deck. We had maybe a dozen Wildcat and 8 Avengers spotted for launch. Not much to throw at a battle fleet, but it was all we had. The landing signal officer was frantically waving planes into position, trying to get us launched before enemy fire found our range. The Kitkun Bay shuddered as another salvo bracketed her. Through my canopy, I could see the massive pagoda-style masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon, their guns winking with orange fire. Closer in, heavy cruisers were racing toward our formation, their 8-inch rifles adding to the storm of steel falling around us. Tommy's Wildcat taxied up alongside mine, and I could see him gesturing frantically at the enemy formation. His radio crackled in my headset. "Jack, you seeing this? There's got to be 20 ships out there." "I see him," I replied, running through my pre-flight checks. "Just like training, Tommy. We go in, we hit him hard, and we get out." But this wasn't like training at all. In training, we never faced odds like this. The Japanese center force represented everything Admiral Kurita had left, the super battleships Yamato and Nagato, heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya, and a screen of destroyers. Against them, Taffy 3 had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. It was David versus Goliath, except David only had a slingshot and Goliath had brought his entire family. The flight deck officer gave me the signal to taxi forward. The Kitkun Bay was turning hard to port, trying to open the range while presenting her stern to the enemy. Black smoke poured from her single stack as the engineers pushed her merchant marine power plant to its limits. All around us, the other escort carriers of Taffy 3 were launching aircraft as fast as they could: White Plains, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, Gambier Bay, and Kilianan Bay. Every plane that could fly was getting airborne. I rolled into position behind the catapult officer, who was crouched beside the deck edge, his checkered flag raised. The ship's motion was violent, climbing swells, then dropping into troughs with bone-jarring impacts. Timing the launch would be critical. If we went off the bow during a down pitch, we'd fly straight into the ocean. The catapult officer's flag came down, and I shoved the throttle to the firewall. The right R-1820 howled, and the Wildcat leaped forward, accelerating down the short flight deck. At the bow, we dropped toward the water, but the Wildcat's stubby wings bit into the air, and I pulled her level just above the wave tops. Tommy launched right behind me, followed by 6 more Wildcats and 4 TBF Avengers loaded with torpedoes and bombs. As I climbed away from the carrier, I got my first clear look at what we were facing. The Japanese formation stretched across the horizon like a steel-gray wall. The super battleship Yamato led the formation, her 18.1-inch guns already trained on our carriers. Behind her came the battleships Nagato, Congo, and Haruna, their 14-inch and 16-inch rifles adding to the barrage. Heavy cruisers flanked the battle line, while destroyers raced ahead like hunting dogs. Our own destroyers were already engaging. I watched in amazement as USS Johnston, Hoel, and Herman charged straight at the Japanese battle line, their 5-inch guns blazing. It was suicide, but it was magnificent suicide. The tin cans were buying us time, trading their lives for precious minutes that would let us get organized and launch our attack. Composite 5 flight. This is Kitkun Control, came the voice of our air group commander. Form up and prepare for attack run. Target the leading heavy cruisers. I looked down at my fuel gauge and ammunition counters. 400 rounds for each of my 4 50 caliber machine guns, and maybe 2 hours of fuel. Not much to work with, but it had to be enough. We formed up at 8,000 feet, 12 Wildcats and 4 Avengers from multiple carriers. Below us, the sea battle raged with primeval fury. Our destroyers weaved between towering waterspouts, firing their guns as fast as they could load them. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had joined the charge, her single 5-inch gun barking defiance at ships 10 times her size. Smoke screens billowed across the water as our ships tried to hide in their own exhaust. There, Tommy called over the radio. Heavy cruiser, bearing 270, range 5 miles. I saw her, one of the Tone-class heavy cruisers, probably Chikuma, racing toward our formation with her main battery trained on the escort carriers. Her 8-inch guns flashed, and seconds later, geysers of water erupted around the White Plains. "All right, boys," I transmitted. "Let's show these bastards what American aircraft can do. Wildcats will strafe the superstructure and AA guns. Avengers, put your fish into her engine room. Attack." I rolled over and dove toward the cruiser, pulling my fighter into a 60-degree dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000 feet. The cruiser grew larger in my gun sight, her pagoda-style bridge structure bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Red tracers began reaching up toward me, lazy-looking at first, then accelerating into deadly streaks as they passed the cockpit. At 2,000 feet, I pressed the trigger. All 4 machine guns hammered, walking there. 50 caliber rounds across the cruiser superstructure. I could see my tracer sparking off steel, blowing apart radio antennae and searchlights. A secondary explosion flashed near the bridge, probably an ammunition locker cooking off. I pulled out of the dive just above the cruiser's mainmast, so low I could see individual Japanese sailors manning the AA guns. One of them swung a 25mm mount in my direction, but I was past him before he could fire. The Wildcat screamed over the cruiser's stern, climbing hard for altitude. Behind me, the Avengers were beginning their torpedo runs. These were the same TBF pilots who'd been flying milk runs over Leyte, dropping supplies and mail to the ground forces. Now they were boring in on a heavy cruiser at 90 feet above the water, Japanese flak bursting all around them. Lieutenant Commander Bob Jenkins led the flight, his Avenger steady as a rock despite the curtain of fire rising to meet him. "Torpedo away," Jenkins called. I watched his torpedo splash into the water, running straight and true toward the cruiser's starboard side. The other Avengers followed, each pilot holding his nerve until the last possible second before releasing his fish and pulling up through the flak. One TBF staggered as shells tore through its wing, but the pilot held it together long enough to get his torpedo away. The cruiser tried to turn, but she was too close and moving too fast. 3 torpedoes struck her amidships in rapid succession, massive explosions blowing chunks of steel and superstructure into the air. She began listing immediately, black smoke pouring from her engineering spaces. "Good hits," Tommy called out. "She's slowing down," but our success came at a price. The damaged TBF that had taken flak was streaming coolant from its engine, the right R-2600 beginning to seize. I watched the pilot, Ensign Dave Patterson, nurse his crippled bomber toward the nearest friendly ship, but the engine finally quit at 500 feet. The Avenger pancaked into the sea, its crew scrambling into their life raft as the bomber sank. "Rescue needed," I transmitted. "Downed aircrew." Bearing 095 from the formation. The destroyer escort Dennis Williams broke from the screen and raced toward the downed aircrew, her crew already manning boat hooks and cargo nets. Under fire from Japanese cruisers, she slowed just long enough to haul Patterson and his crew aboard, then resumed her station. Meanwhile, the surface battle continued to rage. The destroyer Johnston was trading punches with the entire Japanese battle line, her 5-inch guns firing so rapidly that their barrels glowed red-hot. I watched her take 3 14-inch shells from a battleship, massive explosions that should have blown her in half. Instead, she kept fighting, kept firing, kept charging into the teeth of the enemy formation. "Jack, look at that," Tommy called, his voice filled with awe. Following his gaze, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The Japanese formation was turning away. Kurita's powerful center force, which had been moments away from destroying our escort carriers, was breaking off the action and heading north. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. We'd been outnumbered 20-1, outgunned 100-1, and somehow we'd turned back the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. Then I realized what had happened. Our desperate attacks, the suicidal destroyer charges, our scattered airstrikes, the aggressive maneuvering of the escort carriers, had convinced Kurita that he was facing a much larger force. In the smoke and confusion of battle, he'd mistaken our escort carriers for fleet carriers, our destroyers for cruisers. The Japanese admiral had blinked first, but our victory celebration was short-lived. As I climbed back to altitude, ready to pursue the retreating Japanese ships, new contacts appeared on the northern horizon. The swarant ships, they were aircraft, a formation of at least 30 Japanese planes heading straight for our carriers. "Bandits! Bandits!" the radio crackled. Multiple aircraft, bearing 350, range 10 miles, low altitude. I looked down at my fuel gauge. Half empty, maybe 40 minutes of flying time remaining. My ammunition counter showed I'd expended about 100 rounds in my strafing run. Still plenty of fight left in both the plane and the pilot. "Composite 5 flight. This is Morrison," I transmitted. "Form up on me. We've got company coming." The Japanese formation was a mixed bag, 0 fighters providing escort for D-3 Aval dive bombers and B-5 NK torpedo planes. They were flying low, skimming the wave tops to avoid radar detection until the last moment. But we had altitude advantage and the initiative. "Tommy, take your section and hit the torpedo planes," I ordered. "I'll handle the dive bombers." "Roger that, Jack." "Let's get 'em." The two formations merged at 3,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. What followed was the most intense air combat I'd ever experienced. Japanese Zeros pulled up to meet us, their 20mm cannons winking as they tried to break up our attack. I rolled inverted and dove on a valve that was lining up on the St. Lo, my Wildcats 450s converging on the dive bomber's engine. The Japanese pilot saw me coming and tried to turn, but the valve was too slow and heavy. My rounds walked up his fuselage from tail to cockpit, blowing apart his canopy and setting his engine on fire. The dive bomber nosed over and augured straight into the sea. "Splash one valve," I called, pulling up and looking for another target. The sky was full of twisting, turning aircraft. American Wildcats and Avengers mixed it up with Japanese Zeros and bombers in a three-dimensional chess game played at 300 miles per hour. Tracer fire crisscrossed the air like deadly spider webs. Aircraft fell burning into the sea on both sides. I saw Tommy merge with a Zero, both fighters turning inside each other in a tight circle. The Japanese pilot was good. His Zero could outturn the Wildcat in a sustained fight. But Tommy had altitude and energy. He rolled out of the turn, pulled up into a climbing barrel roll, then came down on the Zero from above. A short burst from his 50s, and the Zero's fuel tank exploded. But the Japanese weren't finished. Even as their escort fighters fell to our guns, their bombers kept boring in on the carriers. I watched a Kate torpedo plane skim over the water toward the Gambier Bay, American flak reaching up like fingers of fire. The Kate's torpedo splashed into the water, running hot and straight toward the escort carrier's port side. The Gambier Bay tried to turn, but she was too slow. The torpedo struck just forward of her island, a massive explosion that lifted her entire bow out of the water. She began listing immediately, her flight deck canting at a crazy angle as seawater poured into her hull. "Gambier Bay's hit," someone screamed over the radio. "She's going down." More Japanese bombers were lining up on the other carriers. I dove on a valve that was approaching the St. Lo, but before I could get into range, something caught my eye. A single aircraft, flying alone, approaching the formation from the northeast. At first glance, it looked like another bomber, but something was wrong with its approach. It wasn't pulling up to bomb or dropping to torpedo level. It was flying straight and level, directly toward the St. Lo's flight deck. Then I understood. This wasn't a bombing run. This was something new, something we'd heard rumors about but never seen. This Japanese pilot had no intention of pulling out of his dive. He was going to fly his aircraft directly into our ship. "Kamikaze," I screamed into the radio. "Suicide plane approaching St. Lo." I pushed the throttle to maximum power and dove toward the Japanese aircraft. A Zero fighter loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb. The pilot had to see me coming. My Wildcat was screaming down at him from his starboard quarter, but he never deviated from his course. His entire focus was on the escort carrier below. I opened fire at 800 yards, my 50 caliber round sparking off the Zero's fuselage and wings. Pieces of aluminum flew off the Japanese fighter, but it kept flying, kept heading for the carrier. At 400 yards, I scored hits on the engine, white coolant streaming from the cowling. Still, the kamikaze pilot held his course. The Zero was 50 feet above the St. Lo's flight deck when my bullets finally found the pilot. The fighter wavered for a moment, then rolled inverted and slammed into the escort carrier's flight deck in a tremendous fireball. The explosion blew apart the wooden deck planking and ignited aviation gasoline stored below. Within minutes, the St. Lo was a floating inferno. I pulled up from my dive, breathing hard, hands shaking on the control stick. I'd shot down the kamikaze, but too late to save the ship. The St. Lo was doomed, her crew abandoning ship as fires spread throughout her hull. The air battle was winding down. Most of the Japanese aircraft had been shot down or driven off, but at a terrible cost. We'd lost the Gambier Bay to torpedo attack and the St. Lo to the first kamikaze assault off the war. Several other carriers had been damaged. Our own losses in aircraft were mounting, fuel running low, ammunition expended, pilots pushing their luck too far. "All aircraft, this is Taffy 3, came the voice of Admiral Sprague. "Return to base and land as soon as possible." Good work today. I looked around the sky, taking a mental count of our surviving aircraft. We'd started the morning with maybe 50 planes. Now I could see perhaps 30 still flying. Some had been shot down in combat. Others had crashed attempting to land on damaged carriers. The pilots who ditched were being picked up by destroyers and destroyer escorts, but equipment loss were severe. Tommy formed up on my wing as we approached the Kitkun Bay. The escort carrier looked like she'd been through a meat grinder. Shell holes in her superstructure, her flight deck scarred by near misses, smoke still rising from fires that had been extinguished. But she was afloat, and her arresting gear was rigged for recovery operations. "How's your fuel, Tommy?" I asked over the radio. "About 10 minutes," he replied. "You?" I checked my gauge. "Same. Let's get down before we have to swim home." The landing was routine after everything we'd been through. The Kitkun Bay's flight deck crew guided us into the arresting wires with practiced efficiency, despite the damage to their ship. As my Wildcat rolled to a stop, Chief Martinez was already there with his crew, checking for battle damage and preparing the fighter for its next mission. I climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs, my flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Tommy landed right behind me, his Wildcat's engine smoking from overheating. All around the flight deck, pilots and aircrew were embracing, counting heads, checking on friends who might not have made it back. "How many did we lose?" I asked Chief Martinez. The veteran NCO's face was grim. 12 aircraft so far, Lieutenant. 6 pilots still missing. And we lost Patterson's crew when that Avenger went down during the first attack. 12 aircraft and 6 pilots. In a single morning's action, our composite squadron had lost nearly a quarter of its strength. But we'd accomplished the impossible. We'd turned back the most powerful Japanese naval force in the Pacific, sunk 3 heavy cruisers, and introduced the Imperial Navy to the reality of American naval aviation. I walked to the flight deck edge and looked out over the water. The sea was littered with debris, oil slicks, floating wreckage, life rafts carrying survivors from sunken ships. In the distance, destroyers were still fishing men out of the water, American and Japanese alike. The ocean had no favorites in war. Admiral Sprague's voice came over the ship's announcing system. "This is Admiral Sprague. I want every man in this task group to know that you have participated in one of the most gallant actions in the history of the United States Navy. Against overwhelming odds, you have defeated a superior enemy force and saved the Leyte operation. Your courage and dedication will be remembered forever." But victory had come at a terrible price. The destroyer Johnston had finally succumbed to her wounds, breaking in half and sinking with most of her crew. The destroyer Hoel had suffered the same fate, overwhelmed by enemy fire after her heroic charge. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, the ship so small she was nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, had also gone down fighting. Over 1,000 American sailors had died in the Battle of Samar. We'd lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. Against this, the Japanese had lost 3 heavy cruisers and several destroyers, plus the bulk of their attacking aircraft. More importantly, they'd lost their last chance to disrupt the Leyte operation. As the afternoon wore on, reports filtered in from other parts of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Halsey's fast carriers had caught the Japanese northern force and destroyed what remained of their carrier aviation. The southern force had been annihilated at Surigao Strait. In 4 days of fighting, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered its most devastating defeat, losing 26 warships and hundreds of aircraft. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over, and Japan had lost the war at sea. But for those of us who'd fought in the air over Samar, the immediate concern was simpler. We were alive, our ships were still afloat, and we'd done our duty. Tommy and I sat on the edge of the flight deck that evening, sharing a cup of coffee and watching the sun set over the Philippine Sea. The water was calm now, almost peaceful, giving no hint of the violence that had raged there just hours before. "Think it's over?" Tommy asked. "The war, I mean." I thought about that question for a long time before answering. We'd won a great victory, no doubt about it. The Japanese fleet was broken, their carrier aviation destroyed. But I'd seen that kamikaze pilot's face as he dove toward the St. the absolute determination to die for his emperor. An enemy that fought with that kind of fanaticism wouldn't give up easily. "No," I finally said. "I think the worst is still ahead of us." I was right, of course. The kamikaze attacks we'd seen at Samar were just the beginning. Over the following months, hundreds of Japanese pilots would follow that first suicide attacker's example, diving their aircraft into American ships in a final, desperate attempt to turn the tide of war. But they'd already lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy's power had been broken in the waters off Leyte Gulf, and no amount of individual sacrifice could repair that damage. The Battle of Samar had been the last time Japanese surface ships would threaten American operations in the Pacific. From that day forward, the war would be a one-sided affair, with American forces pushing inexorably toward the Japanese home islands while their enemy's capacity to resist grew weaker with each passing month. We'd accomplished something remarkable that morning off Samar. A handful of escort carriers and their screening ships had turned back a battle fleet. Outnumbered, outgunned, and surprised, we'd fought with such ferocity and skill that the enemy had been convinced they were facing a superior force. It was one of those moments in military history when training, courage, and sheer determination combined to achieve the impossible. But the cost had been terrible. Over the following days, as we received casualty reports and damage assessments, the full price of victory became clear. Families back home would receive telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died in service to their country. Ships that had taken years to build had been destroyed in minutes. Aircraft that represented millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours of labor were now resting on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. War is like that, a paradox of heroism and waste, of noble sacrifice and senseless destruction. We'd won a great victory at Samar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd all lost something in the process. The Japanese pilot who'd crashed into the St. Lo had been somebody's son, trained to fight and die for his beliefs, just as we'd been trained to fight and die for ours. In the end, the only difference between us was which flag we saluted. Years later, when people asked me about the war, they usually want to hear about the heroics, the dogfights, the bombing runs, the dramatic moments when everything hung in the balance. And there were plenty of those moments at Samar. But what I remember most clearly is the quiet afterward, sitting on that flight deck with Tommy, watching the sun set over water that had claimed so many lives. We were young men who'd been asked to do an old man's job, and somehow we'd risen to the challenge. We'd defended our ships, protected our shipmates, and helped win a victory that would be remembered as long as people study naval warfare. But we'd also discovered that victory tastes different than you expect, bitter as well as sweet, shadowed by the knowledge of what it cost to achieve. The battle off Samar was over, but the war would continue for another 10 months. There would be more battles, more losses, more young men who wouldn't make it home to their families. But we'd proven something important that morning off the Philippine coast, that American sailors and aviators, when pushed to the limit, would fight with a courage and determination that could overcome any odds. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all we had.